Hey Optimancers, Chris here. About a week ago, I took a first look at the new Expert Classes 1D&D Unearthed Arcana release, along with Taryn from Indestructiboy. We took a look through the document, and we recorded our first reactions. However, we didn't do an in-depth look, and we both decided that the playtest actually needs that kind of detail to be properly evaluated. So instead of releasing the rest of that first reaction, I've read through the document in detail, and in my next few videos I'm going to give you an in-depth look at this playtest, what it changes from the current rules, and how big a deal those changes are, and what this tells us about the direction the designers seem to be taking with D&D overall. Also, since these are playtest unofficial releases, we can't be sure which of these are going to make it to the final product, but I can speculate, so I'll provide my best guess as to which of these I think are going to make it to the next player's handbook, and which I think have a good chance of being changed or removed. We're going to start with the rules glossary, so these are just the general rules that have been changed in this document, and this is pretty substantial, and important to frame the class and feat changes that we also see in this document. Okay, so here's how we're going to cover the rules glossary. I want to cover each rule change so that when a rule is affected by some other rule, we've already covered it. So I am going to be jumping around. And so if you're trying to follow in your PDF, it's not going to work out so well, but there is a method to my madness. At the end of this video, you should not only have a good understanding of these rule changes, but how they fit together. I'm also going to be putting these rules on a black background rather than read them right off the document. I think this is easier for you to read this way, but let me know in the comments down below if you prefer this. These videos are supported by my patrons. If you'd be interested in supporting this channel, please find a link to my Patreon page in the video description. Patrons see these videos early and without the YouTube ads, and depending on your level of support, there's also an exclusive Discord community, as well as getting your name recognized in these videos. Today I want to recognize these people: Gishlife, Gakumaru, Hendry, Horby, Ian Johnson, Jay Gemmel, James Makla, James Sprague, James Thomas, Jeff Williams, Jad Sand, John Matera, Jonathan Lexi, Joseph Robideau, Joseph Van Horn, Josh Davis, Justin Times, K.J. Aurelio, Kurt G., LaFurja, IGW, Marlon Rooks, Math Guy Dave, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, and PCZ. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. We're starting with the changes to movement. So on your turn, we can move up to our speed. We all know that already. We can move through other creatures if they're allies, incapacitated, tiny in size, or a creature that is 2 sizes larger or smaller than us, but it is difficult terrain unless the creature is tiny. And we still can't willingly end our move in the space occupied by another creature. Climbing and swimming speeds are covered here in the same place. Basically, if you use your walking speed to climb or swim, each foot of movement costs 1 extra foot, or basically double your movement cost. Triple if it's difficult terrain. And here's a big change. So if you have a climb, fly, or swim speed, you must choose which kind of movement you're going to use each time you take your move. This was a huge source of confusion in 5th edition. For example, if you had a fly speed of 50 and a walking speed of 30, and then you started your turn by flying 30 feet, then you landed and you started walking, how much movement did you have left? It didn't make sense. There were no clear rules on that. Now, technically, there are. So now you choose at the start of your movement which kind of movement you're going to use, and when it's done, it's done. You can't start your move by flying, and then walk, and then swim, and then climb. This is a big limitation, but at least it works, and we actually know how it works. Then we get a simple clarification that if any effect gives us 0 movement, that covers all kinds of movement. And that's easy enough. Okay, so we're moving on to actions. These are the specific actions that are covered in the playtest. We get a significant change to the attack action. Nothing major, but just a good change. We can now equip or unequip a weapon before any attack we make as part of the attack action. Not having this, it was a mistake in 5th edition, and they kind of patched it with the throw and weapon fighting style, but now our character with extra attack can actually draw a weapon, throw it, and then draw another weapon and throw that one. I'm really glad to see this change, and I wouldn't expect it to disappear. It probably doesn't require any changes. I think this is just perfect as is. We also get a rule specifying that you can move between attacks. Now, 5th edition basically has the same rule, but the wording here is probably a bit more clear. Also, the move rule said we can move between actions, so this clarification is necessary here to show we don't have to complete our attack action before continuing our movement. Next, we have the dash action. Basically the same, we can take the action and we can move again on our turn. The difference here is this is defined as another move rather than extra movement, which is actually important. Because if you remember, we can only take one kind of movement with our move. So here is the way that we can combine flying and swimming speeds on the same turn. We fly our flying speed, and then we can dash and swim our swimming speed. Next, we have changes to the help action. This is another one I'm glad to see changes and clarification for. Assisting ability checks and attack rolls are officially separated, so that's a great change. If we assist with an ability check, it requires we have the skill proficiency. So you can't help someone with the Arcana check anymore if you know nothing about Arcana. I like that clarification. Also, helping someone with their initiative roll or dispel magic check or anything silly like that, it's no longer even theoretically possible. Though as before, the DM is going to decide whether helping is appropriate. Then we have assisting on an attack roll, and this clears up some confusion with the 5th edition rules. There's never been a clear consensus whether help provides advantage on the next attack against an enemy, or whether you can choose the ally you specifically help and they get advantage even if it's not the next attack. Here it is clarified. You choose the ally that is helped, whether it is the next attack or not. Great, I'm good with that. Next we have the hide action. Here's one I have mixed feelings about, though hiding is something that needed changed, but I'm not 100% behind this. So now hiding has a set DC of 15, and I find this odd, honestly. I mean, hiding from the drunk guard and hiding from the paranoid beholder have the same DC. It makes me guess that passive checks may be gone entirely. Not sure if that's something that needed to go. At least it clarifies, for the first time, that we need heavy obscurement or 3/4 or total cover. You also have to be out of the enemy's line of sight, and I think we need yet more clarification here as well. In 5th edition, basically, you can see all around you. Is that changing? Makes sense if it does, though I think this is going to end up being a case of the DM just arbitrarily deciding. If you successfully hide, then you get the hidden condition, which we will cover later, and your check result is now the DC to find you, and this says with a wisdom perception check. But I think they potentially flubbed the language here, because based on what we read later, this probably should say with a search action, which we're going to cover right now. So the search action is a wisdom check you make for insight rolls to determine a creature's state of mind, medicine checks to discern a creature's state of health, perception checks to discover a concealed creature or object, which should be the case with the previously mentioned hidden condition, or survival checks to find tracks or food. Overall, I'm okay with this, though it seems like weird wording, like I'm going to search to figure out if the person I'm talking to is being forthright. But that's a small thing. I think what they've tried to do here is fit all the wisdom checks together, and then later we'll see all the intelligence checks together. And we end up with some wording that's a little awkward, to be honest. Moving on, we have the influence action. So this is new and shiny. So we can take an action to try to influence another creature. It's clarified that it isn't mind control, so you can't influence someone to do something counter to their nature. We start with attitude of the creature towards us, and creatures will be either indifferent, friendly, or hostile. Basically, if a creature is indifferent, the influence action might persuade it to do something. If it's friendly to you, you might even persuade it to do something risky. And if it's hostile, you may not be able to persuade it to do anything. But if you can, it will likely require challenging DCs, and maybe multiple successful checks. We're instructed then to role play the interaction, and the DM can determine based on that role playing if the charisma check will have advantage, disadvantage, or be a straight up roll, as well as determine what kind of check you're going to be making. I like this, because we are instructed to have the player making the influence action make a charisma check and apply animal handling, deception, intimidation, or persuasion as appropriate. I like that this determination is made after the interaction is role-played. Sometimes something like deception may come into play as part of the role-playing experience, rather than the initial intent. We're also given some basic interaction results based on the creature's attitude and what kind of influence we can expect based on the results of the check. Overall, I like this. Okay, so this one is going to be controversial. The jump action. Yeah, jumping now uses your action. So basically, you take the action, then you make a DC 10 strength check using either acrobatics or athletics. Now, this is new since acrobatics previously wasn't used for jumping, but this also confirms that we're going to be able to mix and match abilities with skills. So in the case of jumping, we're using strength, regardless of whether we're using acrobatics or athletics. Sorry, monks and rogues. Your check result is the number of feet you jump up to your speed score, or half the result for a vertical jump. If you fail the DC 10 check, then you can jump 5 feet vertically or horizontally. And honestly, that seems pretty generous to me for a high jump. But regardless of your result, your jump action doesn't use any of your regular movement, so this is a bit like the dash action, except you're jumping. Like with movement, this is clearly a limitation we didn't have before. Before, technically, your entire move could be a series of jumps, which is honestly pretty silly. So I think I'm good with this from a, just makes sense point of view. Okay, so magic is now an action. This includes casting a spell or using a magic item that requires an action. In the case of spells that require longer, basically you take the magic action over and over until the casting time is completed, and it uses your concentration. If there's a reason for magic to be an official action now, it's not made clear in this document, but we may eventually see why this is now a listed action. Our final action in this document is also new, and that's the study action. These are all intelligence checks. So you'll notice we have our wisdom checks, our charisma checks, and now our intelligence checks. And these involve a study of our memory, a book, a creature, a clue, an object, or another source of knowledge to recall important information about it. And this part I love. We have a table, and that table tells us that if you want to recall information about a giant, it's a history check. An elemental, that's arcana. A dragon, that's nature. And undead, that's religion. So glad to have that actually spelled out. Otherwise, these all do what you think they would, except it's clarified that these are actions. So in our last playtest, we saw some new conditions and changes to existing conditions like grappled, slowed, and incapacitated. Here we have some more condition changes. I'm going to cover my favorite change first, the exhausted condition. Exhaustion in 5th edition is absolutely brutal, both in gameplay and design. It's also really difficult to memorize. But basically, there's 6 levels, and the 6th level is death. However, by the 2nd level, you are getting absolutely hammered. Now, we have a nice, easy system with a linear progression. There's 10 levels of exhaustion, and you die if you exceed those 10. Each time you make a test, you subtract your exhaustion level from the result. It's also subtracted from the DCs of any spells you cast. A long rest reduces your exhaustion level by 1. Look at that. 8 years playing 5th edition, and I don't have the current exhaustion system memorized. But I already have this new exhaustion system down. Now the penalties, they're still significant, but they're not wildly exponential like they were before. This is just better. Way better. I love this change, and I hope this makes it to the player's handbook. Also, it actually makes me excited to see the Berserker in our new edition. Next, we have a new condition, hidden. Now, the hiding rules in 5th edition are super unclear. They're scattered all over the place, and improving them, honestly, it's just a really low bar. Making hidden a condition is a decent start, maybe. Maybe not though. I'll explain afterwards. So we have 3 features of being hidden, as well as some rules to end the condition. First, you can't be affected by anything that requires you be seen. Makes sense. Second, we see that being hidden provides you advantage on your initiative rolls. Now this is interesting. Like with incapacitated, we see this labeled as surprise. I think we're in the process of seeing a complete redesign of the surprise mechanics in the game, and that's great, honestly. I think we need a little more before I can really figure out how surprise is supposed to work in 1D&D though. I mean, maybe this is it. If you're hidden, advantage on initiative. But I just wouldn't make that conclusion just yet. I suspect there might be more to come on surprise. Finally, attack rolls against us have disadvantage, and our attack rolls have advantage. What's interesting here is you can attack a hidden creature. I would like more clarification yet, but basically the way I figure this would go is if that rogue keeps hiding behind that same rock, I mean the enemy knows the rogue is behind the rock, even if they can't see them. So unless that rogue has full cover, then it's reasonable they could be attacked with disadvantage. So I'm okay with this, but again, there could be some more clarification here. What I would really like to see are some clear rules on whether you know the location of a hidden or invisible creature or not. Hopefully, that's yet to come. Finally, we get some rules for ending the hidden condition. If you make a sound louder than a whisper. If an enemy finds you, so that would be the search action we covered already. If you make an attack roll. If you cast a spell with a verbal component, or if you aren't heavily obscured or behind any cover, then the condition ends. Now here is the question I have. Obscured or have cover from whom? I mean, if hidden is a condition, then you either have it or you don't have it. So you're not going to be hidden from some creatures and not from others. So do you need cover from your allies too? That's a bit weird if that's the case, and I think that's an issue with this being a condition. Because if it's a condition, then it should apply to everyone. So if you're hidden from allies as well as enemies, and you don't have cover or obscurement from an ally, then do you have the hidden condition at all? I think this is a good start to the thought process on how making hiding could work, but this needs some more work. Maybe it's just a clarification that the hidden condition can just apply to your enemies. I don't know, but I hope that this isn't the last iteration we see regarding hiding. So next is the invisible condition. This ends up being pretty close to the hidden condition, but it doesn't have the requirements or the various ways the condition is lost. Notice surprise again, giving advantage on initiative checks. Also, notice that advantage and initiative, as well as the advantage on attacks and disadvantage to be attacked, is separated from the unseeable effect, just like it is in the current condition. Now, Jeremy Crawford said that if you don't disable the invisible condition, and I'm talking about the current 5th edition, then just seeing an invisible enemy doesn't affect the advantage or disadvantage portion of that condition, and that was intentional. And I've been skeptical of his insistence that it was intended. I believe I even say in a video that's upcoming on invisibility that I'm releasing soon, that I doubt that it was intended, but I think I need to walk that back. We're clearly seeing here the same thing. Removing unseeable does not change the surprise or attacks affected portions of this condition, just as it was before. So even if it wasn't intentional last time, it seems to be absolutely intentional now. And we're going to see examples of how this works, and I'll be covering that later in this video. Okay, so let's move on to tests. In the last playtest, ability checks, saving throws, and attack rolls, they were lumped together, and they were now referred to as tests. By the way, I'm fairly confident the term tests is going to survive the playtest. I just think there's a significant advantage to having a term that applies to these 3 types of roles, so I just don't see any reason they would change that. Now, there was some really controversial changes to these kinds of roles in the last playtest, namely 1s being auto failures for all tests and 20s being auto successes. also gaining inspiration on a 20, and especially the changes to critical hits. So now we're told to consider 1s to provide inspiration, which is now called heroic inspiration, by the way. We'll get to that. So this is instead of 20s providing that inspiration. And it's interesting. I've had many conversations with some of you and other content creators regarding trying 1s instead of 20s for inspiration. So it's interesting to me to see it here. I'm curious if we'll see some other ideas in upcoming releases. I mean, overall, I still have concerns about spamming tests to get inspiration, but I think trying 1s instead of 20s, it's at least an interesting idea. You'll all be glad to know that the critical hit proposed changes have been dropped entirely. They haven't provided anything new here for critical hits. They just say to use your 2014 Player's Handbook. I don't know if they'll have any more ideas for critical hits, but it seems for now they want us to use the rules we have. And considering that Sneak Attack didn't have the wording that it doubles on a critical hit some of us were speculating might be there, I think it's a good thing too. And the 1s and 20s being auto-fails and successes, it's also dropped. So I expect many of you will be happy to see that, though we don't know if it's going to come back later yet. In this glossary, we get a lot more information about one kind of test, and that's the ability check. We've already seen some of that in my coverage of what kind of actions we now have. So this includes checks with skills or tools, as well as checks off our ability scores, like initiative, which is a dexterity check. First, they cover skills, which are pretty much the same as the current edition. The wording might be different, but just like 5th edition, the DM determines if a skill proficiency applies to an ability check, and if you're proficient in that skill, then you add your proficiency bonus, or double your bonus if you're an expert in that skill, which is a feature we see in all 3 classes in this document. One change is these rules now specify that using an ability check requires an action unless a rule says specifically otherwise. And we've seen this already with search, study, and influence actions that we've already covered. But basically, if you're making an ability check, unless a rule says otherwise, then it's an action. We're given a bit more information about assigning DC or difficulty class to the roll. We're told that a 15 should be your standard DC, so if you aren't sure, assign a 15. We saw a DC of 15 already with the hide action. It also specifies that if the DC would be really low, then you probably shouldn't bother with the roll, which I like. I mean, that's how I play now anyways, but it's good to have it there for newer DMs. And we're given this chart that helps us out a bit more, ranging from 5 for a very easy check, which again, they say not to bother with unless the result is narratively interesting, up to 30 for a nearly impossible check. There's one more clarification I would like to see them add here. They specify a DC of 5 is probably not worth a roll. A DM should be able to say that something a player wants their character to do just isn't possible. And that's probably implied here, since the chart stops at 30, but I think it could be helpful to actually spell that out. Now this is just semantics, but the term armor proficiency has been changed to armor training. What I think is happening here is that we're getting away from referring to anything as proficiency that doesn't involve our proficiency bonus. I mean, that's probably a good move. It just makes things clearer. Like, we don't add our proficiency bonus to armor class, so it makes sense, and I think this is going to stick. Now here's one that has me excited. Blindsight. In 5th edition, nobody knows how Blindsight works. Here, we actually have rules. You can effectively see without physical sight. We can effectively see anything within range that isn't behind total cover. That's something nobody knew before. We can see even if we're blinded. Thank you. We can see in darkness. We can see creatures that are hidden or invisible within range. Now, if you recall the hidden condition, being discovered by an enemy ends the condition. So you can't hide from someone with blindsight. However, remember the invisible condition? This doesn't end the condition, and the surprise and attacks affected portions of the invisible condition are still going to apply. So like I said, I guess that was intentional. Or at least it is here. So if you're invisible, a creature with blindsight can see you, but they still get disadvantaged to attack you, and you still have advantage to attack them. Difficult terrain basically works the same way as the current edition, but we are given a bit more insight into what qualifies as difficult terrain. I like seeing that slopes are now explicitly difficult terrain. Okay, moving on, heroic inspiration. So we already covered that now we'll be testing natural ones, providing heroic inspiration, but also let's note we're changing it from being simply inspiration to heroic inspiration. It's like they suddenly figured out that it's confusing when inspiration from bards and inspiration from the DM are called the exact same thing. So heroic inspiration it is. Big change here, and a good one. You now apply inspiration after the roll. Thank you. Once again, like with a lucky feat we saw last time, we see advantage applied after a roll is made. And just like last time, I would love additional clarification on how this works if we already had advantage or disadvantage on the roll. So if I had disadvantage, I roll 2 dice. How do I apply advantage after the roll is made? Do I take one of the dice away? Which one? Designers, please give us some clarification here. If we can't apply advantage after a check if it already had advantage or disadvantage, that's fine, but spell that out. Okay, so here's a biggie and a goodie. It's the light weapon property, but really, it's our fix to 2-weapon fighting. Yeah, 2-weapon fighting just got a huge change, and here it is. When you take the attack action on your turn and attack with a light weapon in one hand, you can make an extra attack as part of the same action. That extra attack must be made with a different light weapon in the other hand, and you don't apply your ability modifier to the attack's damage, unless you have the 2-weapon fighting style, of course, and we'll cover that in feats. So 2-weapon fighting no longer requires a bonus action, and that is amazing. Now, if we really want to know if 2-weapon fighting is now good, then it really depends on how it compares to the other methods of fighting. And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole right now, as it involves the new feats in this document. But the quick of it is, based on what we've been shown so far, it fares pretty well. I don't think it's good enough to be the default choice, but it's a decent choice, and that's exactly where we wanted 2-weapon fighting to be. I find it's really interesting how we see different rules in this playtest, and we read them on their own and we think that's terrible, but then we see them together and we kind of see how things are supposed to work. So when I get into feats in my next video, I'll discuss how they kind of work with light weapons, and together they actually work reasonably well, at least in my opinion. Now, a couple little things I'm going to point out here. The first is that this can only be applied on your turn, so no 2-weapon fighting on attacks of opportunity. Also, you won't be able to do it with a ready-to-attack action. Also, I've heard some mention of 2-weapon fighting with hand crossbows, but the ammunition property isn't going to allow reloading with no free hands, so unless they're repeating crossbows, that isn't going to fly. But we do have repeating crossbows, and then that would be pretty cool. We're also going to need to revisit this when we talk about the crossbow expert feat in my next video. Okay, now long rests. And long rests now provide all your hit dice back. Yes, I will be gushing over this in the survey. This is something I figured was a no-brainer, and was a bit disappointed it wasn't in the last playtest document. I am super glad to see it here. Ability scores are also all restored after a long rest if they had been reduced, and it makes me wonder if we're going to see more of that in 1D&D. The bit about getting the benefits of a short rest with an interrupted long rest, they're still here, and this doesn't clearly answer the questions about rest casting any more than our last document did. If you don't know what I mean about rest casting, you can check my video on that last playtest. Okay, ritual casting. So if you prepare a spell with the ritual tag, you can now cast it as a ritual, so you no longer require the ritual casting feature to be part of your class. I'm all for this, but I'm hoping they offset this change with some new ways to differentiate different kinds of spellcasters. And just a quick one here. The short sword is now a simple weapon instead of a martial one. This means a character with simple weapon proficiency isn't limited to daggers if they're looking for a finesse weapon. Also, with simple weapon proficiency, you'll be able to 2-weapon fight with short swords. And I'm good with this. Also, we get some clarification on teleportation. So the obvious one is it doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity, which is how it's always been, but it's no longer going to require a sage advice to clarify that. Here's a big one, though, that you might have missed. Teleportation says, if you teleport, you disappear and reappear elsewhere instantly without moving through the intervening space. This transportation doesn't expand movement. So let's take a spell like Spirit Guardians. It says, you take damage if you move into the spell's effect. And the way, at least I read this, teleportation shouldn't apply, because teleportation transports you into the spell effect without moving or using movement. Let me know if you read this differently, but that's how I read it anyways. If that's the way it's intended, that's a big clarification, because a lot of players and DMs have assumed teleportation does count as moving in regards to these kinds of spells. This would make teleportation better than ever. So to finish up, let's hit some of my favorite stuff in this whole document. We have our first changes to existing spells here, and I'll cover them both together. First, we have the Barkskin Spell. This needed to be changed. The existing Barkskin Spell is terrible, and it makes no sense. With the current Barkskin, let's say you have a 14 armor class, then you cast the spell, well, your armor class increases to 16. Then let's say that character goes behind half cover. Well, their armor class is still 16. It makes no sense. It's also an action to cast. I mean, it's just an awful spell. Here we have a whole new version. Bonus action to cast, thank you. And now instead of an armor class boost, the Barkskin provides temporary hit points. The amount is your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus, so it's going to scale with your level. And that's new. And the temporary hit points keep returning at the start of the target's turns. And this spell is now actually pretty good. Like your 3rd level druid cast this, that's probably about 5 temporary hit points that come back every round. We also have a nice upcast option here, allowing you to cover more than one target with the spell. What we have here is a really nice spell. Not ultra powerful, but reasonable and interesting. I think this is just a terrific change, and honestly gets me really hopeful regarding spells in general. I'm impressed with this. The other spell changed is Guidance. You should know the Guidance cantrip. If you don't, here's a reminder. Can I add Guidance to my initiative? Can I cast Guidance every minute today? Can I add Guidance to that? And repeat. Now, Guidance in 5th edition is a very powerful cantrip, arguably even the most powerful, but it's not good for gameplay at all. I am thrilled to see this rewritten. So our new version is now a reaction. It's no longer a touch spell. We get 30 feet of range. And look at this. The reaction is taken when you or an ally within 30 feet of you fails an ability check. Thank you. Guidance added to initiative, now gone. Questions about when it can be added, now gone. Using concentration is now gone. Casting it every minute is now gone. I love this rewrite. Now for the effects of the spell, we still add a d4 to the check, now added after the check is made, so we only cast it when we need it. And to prevent spamming the spell on every failed check, a creature that benefits from the spell can't gain the benefit again until they finish a long rest. Now personally, I would still take this cantrip. This is still a useful cantrip. It's definitely less powerful than it was, but it is so much cleaner. Again, this just gets me hopeful regarding spell redesign for this playtest. And the changes to Barkskin were good, but Barkskin wasn't a problem. I mean, it was generally ignored, or just not taken, or cast. But here, this is actually going to make gameplay better. If all the spell redesigns we see are this thoughtful, then I am super excited to see the rest, which I assume we'll really start to see in the Priest and Mage playtests. I know when I complete the survey, I'll show some love for both these spell designs. I think this is good stuff. And that is the rules glossary. There is lots of stuff here. Enough I figured it deserved its own thorough breakdown in a video. And it's not even a short video. With these rules, I think we're going to have way more context to actually look at the rest of the playtest, much more objectively than my first reaction videos, and I'm going to be doing that. I'll cover the feats in my next video, and again, some really huge changes that are going to change this game in really significant ways. I hope you'll join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.